Hello everyone! This is Katie Colleen here. Welcome back, Colleen Clan, or if you're new, then come join the family. Today I'll be showing you how to make this beautiful, long, flowy robe for your cosplay. Now this robe is for Auron from Final Fantasy X, and I am making this cosplay for my dad, so he will be doing all the modeling and I will be using his measurements. Let's start with a commercial pattern that we can alter. I did not have any luck finding a full-length robe pattern, so I will be using this McCall's M7525 pattern, and we'll only be using the top and altering that. We don't need the pants. I took the measurement from my dad's shoulder all the way down to where he wanted the hem of his robe, and I will be extending our pattern to that length. So I'm also adding a little bit of extra width to the waist. One thing I will say about this commercial pattern is I do not like how it did its sizing. What I mean is that I feel like this is a perfect pattern for someone who is a small size. But once you move to the large or extra large sizes, this pattern really fails in a lot of areas. And we'll see more of that later. Once I've done this to both the front and the back pattern pieces, I can also take out the sleeve pattern piece, and I'm making this much wider. Auron has these huge flowing sleeves to his robe. Now that I have everything patterned out, I can cut it out in the fabric. Now the fabric I'm using for this robe is a comfy, cozy flannel solid. Now a robe like this, I would have loved to make it in some sort of faux suede or, you know, a nice thick fabric. But what you need to consider with a robe like this is it takes a lot of yardage. So we found the flannel solids fabrics and it was only $3 a yard because it was on sale. So we could get 9 yards of it and it was okay. Now I'm gonna start with the lining layer. So this robe has a red outside, and they didn't have enough red fabric for me to line it in red, so I'm lining it in this navy blue. So this is the inside layer of the robe. Once this is cut out, it's really only a few seams to sew it together. First, I'm sewing together the shoulder seams. So this is the shoulder of the front pieces to the shoulder of the back pieces. And I'm sewing all of these seams with a straight stitch on my sewing machine. And even with just the shoulder seams done, you can already drape your robe over a mannequin and see how it'll fit. So next, let's add our sleeves. The sleeves can be pinned to that shoulder seam as well. With this particular sleeve type, it happens to be a straight line, so I'm just lining up the exact middle of the sleeve to the shoulder seam and sewing that straight line. And now we're getting somewhere. We only have one more seam to sew for this robe, and that is the side seam. And this side seam extends all the way from the very tip of the sleeve up through the armpit and then down all the way to the very bottom hem. This is quite a long seam, but if you do it all at once, it really helps all your seams line up. And our robe is wearable. And the sleeves are a bit much. They're a bit much. Now, this is really the biggest weakness in the commercial pattern I was using. Let me explain. Here is the sleeve piece of the pattern. So when you look at a pattern, they have all these lines with different dashings, and that will tell you the sizes. Now, the sizes are based on the bust, hips, and waist measurements. So you can see small is this dash line here, and medium is about an inch longer. And then large, another inch longer, extra large, and extra, extra large. And with each size, the sleeve gets an inch longer. Okay, so basically, they're saying in this pattern that if you are about an inch or two wider in the waist, your arms extend an extra inch. And humans actually don't just grow in the direction of limb extension. And even more interestingly, you can see the solid line on the edge of the sleeves. A solid line in a pattern means that this does not change with the size. So no matter what size you are, the width of your arm will be the same. It makes no sense to me. And that means that the sleeves were about 4 inches too long and not wide enough. So I went back and I added about 2 inches into the width of the sleeve, and I cut off like a whole 4 or 5 inches off the ends. And with that modification, I can finally do a fitting with my dad and we can see how this looks. Now the sleeves, even after that modification, are still a little bit too long. The length of the sleeves on this pattern was just ridiculous. Everything else seems to fit pretty well though. So now that I have a better idea of what I'm doing, I can take all the same pattern pieces and cut them out in the red fabric, but with the alterations that I have made with what I've learned from making the lining. And I'm going to sew it together in exactly the same way. Shoulder seams, add the sleeves, side seams. And you can see how the outside layer just slides on over our inside layer. Now Auron's robe has quite a bit of detail on it. Now the first detail I am taking a look at is the navy blue trim that goes from the hem of one side of the robe all the way up around the neckline and down the other side of the robe. Now first I need to make my trim. I'm making the trim out of some leftover navy blue fabric that we use for the lining. I'll be cutting out strips on the bias. That means that these strips of fabric will be cut at a 45-degree angle. Cutting fabric in this way allows the fabric to more easily take the shape of curves going around the neckline. And these weren't quite long enough, so I'm going to have to sew a few different strips together. Now with these bias strips, there is a really cool way that you can sew them together so it looks nice. I'm going to line up the 2 ends at a 90-degree angle. And now where those bias strips are overlapping, I'm sewing along the diagonal, and it looks so much smoother than if you sew them end to end. But there are even more details that we can't forget. And that is the white strips of fabric on both sides of our blue trim. I decided to use a piping for this. Now to sew the outside layer to the lining and sew on the trim with our piping, somewhere in between there, we're gonna have to make a fabric sandwich. Now this fabric sandwich includes the red layer on the top, then our white piping, then the navy blue trim, and then finally our lining layer. When I flip it around, you can see we have that really nice piping sticking out. Now there are a few tricks for sewing with piping, and my favorite is to use this piping foot. So the piping foot has this little piping shaped indent in it, and the piping will slide into this indent and you're going to be able to sew in a really nice neat line. This is one of the advantages of using piping, is it's really easy to get those beautiful straight lines if you have the correct piping foot. And now when I flip over our fabric sandwich, the bias is now laying against our red layer. It looks really nice, and we have that beautiful piping sticking on the very edge. Now this all does look a little poofy. So the fabric isn't quite laying flat like I want it to, and I can solve that with a top stitch. So this is a straight stitch that will just go along the very edge of that piping. Now if you're looking for an alternative to a piping foot, you can also use a zipper foot like I am using here. I'm just right up against the edge of that piping, and I'm doing a straight stitch and sewing all of our layers flat. There is a second row of piping that we are going to add. This row of piping is on the opposite side of the trim. So I am attaching our piping just to that single layer of fabric in our trim. And then I'm sewing that piping down with our piping foot. And now that our piping is secured to the other side of our bias strips, I am flipping the piping so you can only see that very edge of the piping. And I'm top stitching that down to the robe. So with that seam finished, let's also hem the bottom of the robe. I am folding in all of our rough edges and pinning them shut. Now I do have a little trick for when your outside layer and lining layer are different colors. So I actually am using a red top thread and a blue bobbin. This means that when I sew along that hem, it will show up red on the red fabric and blue on the blue fabric, and our hem won't be obnoxiously the wrong color. And now for even more details. Remember those overly extravagant sleeves? I don't know why, but Auron happens to keep 4 belts just wrapped around his giant sleeves. and those belts will need belt loops to be fed through. To make a belt loop, just start with a rectangle of fabric. I ended up needing 24 belt loops for this robe. Now I don't want any of these rough cut edges showing on my belt loops, so I am folding our rectangle in half and sewing one edge. Now we have a tube. I'm going to flip all of these inside out. It is a little bit difficult to flip inside out a tube this small, but with the help of, here I'm using a pen, just to kind of push through that fabric as you flip it inside out. It's a little bit easier on the fingers, and you can flip a whole 24 belt loops inside out if you want. So I am folding in those rough edges on the ends, and then I'm doing a top stitch around the entire outside perimeter of our belt loop. This will keep our belt loop flat, and now we can't see any rough seams. And now we can attach these to the robe. I am lining up and pinning all of our belt loops onto the robe sleeves, and then these will be top stitched onto the robe. Now, something important to keep in mind here is we really only want to top stitch these to the outside layer of the robe. So it's a good thing that we left that edge of the sleeve unfinished so that we can just work with the outside layer here. Now, if you really zoom in to this reference picture of Auron, like if you really zoom in, you can see that each of these belt loops has a rivet on each end. So I got 48 rivets, 2 for each belt loop, and I will be installing those on the robe sleeves. First, I have to put a little hole in the belt loop for my rivet to go through. The rivet has this little post on one end, and that will fit through the hole in the fabric. And then the rivet has a back that will snap on. So I set the rivet in, I put our little post on it, and then I take a hammer and I smash it with the hammer. And that is how you install rivets. Now that we finally have all the sleeve details done, we can finish up that very end of our sleeve and put the outside and lining layers together. This sleeve mimics the same navy blue trim and piping that we put around the collar of the robe. I'm cutting out more bias tape. This is a little bit thinner. It's only about 1 inch thick, and I'm sewing that to the edge of our sleeve. I'm remembering to top stitch down our bias trim, and then we can sneak in some piping. I'm attaching the piping to the opposite end of the navy blue trim, and we're going to attach this really the same way we did around the collar of the robe, attaching the piping, and then the piping can be folded over and top stitched down. And with the lining and the outside layer sewn together with that piping in between, our sleeves are finished. If you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comment section down below, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!